A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. One long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
5,000 celebrities later.
6 months later!
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later.
The next morning. Later that night. The next evening. 1 operation later. 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas. Several long days later. Many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. 1 beautiful Christmas morning later. The next morning, many frame building attempts later, even more boat building attempts later, 1 day later, 1 humongous meal later, 1 entree later, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, several bouquets later, 10 hours later, 6.5 hours later,
4 to 6 hours later, 200.5 years later. The next morning, 14 years in the void, 2,103 air flights later, on a loss, 4 to 6 years later, 4 to 6 spaces later, 4 to 6 78 years later, 4 to 6 swiddle later, 4 to 6 birth later, montage, 14 years later, by sheer coincidence, just then, 3:46 a.m. 328 skies later, 421 news later, 2 hours later, 386 glitches later, 765 license later, a little morning, the new Sunday, day 100, Uber later, 365 toys later, an awful morning, flashback 2, end of flashback 2.